Welcome everybody to the Qualitative Methods Masterclass webinar series. I'm Ricardo Contreras and I am here with Juliana Barabas from IIQM and Dr. Bukola Salami from the Faculty of Nursing at the University of Alberta, who is our guest today. Dr. Salami will be presenting community-based participatory action research. A few words before we start. We are going to be here for about an hour. Dr. Salami will be presenting for approximately 40 minutes, perhaps a little bit less or more. While she is presenting, please feel free to write down your questions using the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel. And in fact, you can practice now by writing where you are located, in what country. And then that will allow you to practice for writing your questions. At the end of Dr. Salami's presentation, we will go ahead and start reading your questions. And I will also offer the microphone to some of you in case we have enough time. And if I offer you the microphone, please always start by saying where you are located. Your microphones will remain muted throughout the presentation, and that will avoid echo and background noise. And this webinar is being recorded, and you are going to receive the video of this about 3 hours after the end of the presentation. If you do not see it in your inbox, please check your spam folder. And I see that we have people from Canada, from, let me see, Italy. So far, Italy, Canada, the United States. Paris also, from France. That's very nice. And what other countries? India, it seems. Yeah, so people from many different countries. So everybody be welcome to this presentation. So now I am going to offer the microphone to my colleague from IIQM, the International Institute for Qualitative Methodology, Juliana Barabas. Juliana?
Thank you so much, Ricardo, and thank you to ATLAS for their ongoing support of this series. We have a long and rich history. This series has been continuing since 2013, so I encourage all of you. This webinar will be available on our archive, as are all of the webinars that have been presented in this series. So, for this series, Dr. Bukola Salami is an associate professor at the Faculty of Nursing, University of Alberta. Her research program focuses on policies and practices shaping migrants' health. As of August 2019, she has been involved in over 40 funded research projects. She is the lead on 20 of these projects with funding from national and international agencies. She's led research projects on African immigration child health, immigrant child mental health, access to health care for immigrant children, African migrant youth mental health, migration of nurses as live-in caregivers, experience of temporary foreign workers in Alberta, downward occupational mobility of immigrant nurses, and parenting practices of African immigrants. Dr. Salami has over 40 published scholarly articles in peer-reviewed journals and another 20 under review, 2 book chapters, and 8 reports. She represents the University of Alberta on the steering committee of the Worldwide Universities Network Global Africa Group. She founded and leads an African migrant child research network of 26 scholars from 4 continents. She's involved in several community volunteer initiatives, including serving as a public member on the Council of Alberta College Social Workers. She has a solid track record of training students, with over 30 students, many of whom have received awards, including Canadian Vanier Award and International Development Research Centre Doctoral Award. She herself has received several awards for research excellence and community engagement, 100 Accomplished Black Women in Canada, Sigma Theta Tau International Honor Society of Nursing Emerging Nurse Researcher of the Year Award, College and Associations of Registered Nurses of Alberta, an award for nursing excellence, and Alberta Avenue Edmonton Top 40 Under 40. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Bukola Salami.
Thank you very much, Juliana. And now I am going to give you the controls Dr. Salami, and it's in your hands now.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Juliana, and thank you, Ricardo. How come this is not working? So as Juliana mentioned, I'll be talking about community-based participatory action research today. And as Juliana stated, I'm an associate professor at the Faculty of Nursing, University of Alberta. My presentation is probably going to last around 30 minutes, but we'll see, maybe it will be more. So there's going to be three main parts. I'll discuss about the work that I do in general, and then we'll talk about the main, the key components of a participatory, community-based participatory action research project. And most of my time today will be spent discussing, giving an example of how we went about completing a participatory action research project with youth. With Black youth. I would like to acknowledge my funders. The projects that I'll be discussing today, the bulk of the work was funded by Policy-Wise for Children and Families, a funding agency here in Alberta, but I'll also be touching very lightly on some of the lessons learned from research that has been funded by Women and Children's Health Research Institute, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and MSI Foundation. So about health and immigration policies and practices research program, which I lead, we seek to address the decline in immigrant health in Canada by focusing on the health of the most vulnerable group of immigrants in Canada, including those with precarious immigration status. We have been engaged in over 40 funded research projects to date, with funding from national and international funding agencies. So here are some of the projects that we've been involved in the past. I have been involved in about 40, not involved, but led 40. I've led 4 projects that specifically focused on participatory action research with immigrant populations. So there was one that we did that was a participatory action research project to promote the mental health of African immigrant children in Alberta, which was funded by Women and Children's Health Research Institute. And for this research project, we engaged in conversation cafes with African immigrant parents to improve the health status of their children. And for the Conversation Cafe, what we did was we capitalized on the strength and the agency of African immigrant families as fruitful actors in improving their health. We paired experts in health with members of the immigrant community to co-facilitate session and conversation cafe. This helped in bridging popular health knowledge with medical and scientific health knowledge to improve the health status, and the research was informed by post-colonial perspective. We also did a project, which I'll be discussing later today, that was a participatory action research project to promote the mental health of African, Black, and Caribbean children in Alberta. For this project, we interviewed about 30 youths on their health, and we also engaged in conversation cafes with about 99 youths in Alberta, and I'll discuss the process in detail about this research project. There's a project that we did about temporary foreign workers in Canada and the factors that contribute to their transition to different status. So we interviewed several temporary foreign workers, including those that were undocumented migrant without legal status in Canada, and also those that were that transitioned to international students, to see the factors that contribute and also how we can empower them in terms of improving their well-being. And for this, we used a combination of quantitative methods, including survey. We also did interviews, and we also did a series of focus groups and also conversation cafes. In another project, Parenting and Mental Health Promotion Practices of African Immigrants in Alberta, we engaged in interviews with African immigrant parents, and conversation cafe. At the end of the interview, not conversation cafe, focus groups. At the end of the focus groups and interviews, we held a stakeholder engagement day that was attended by over 150 African immigrant parents and other stakeholders, including teachers, nurses, doctors, and healthcare professionals, to develop and co-develop a strategy to improving African immigrant children well-being. And at the end, we set up a implementation committee to take forward some of the information that we gathered from those sessions. So now move to discussing community-based participatory research. So community-based participatory action research and participatory action research is different from participatory research because of the differences in terms of whether or not an action is included. But community-based participatory action research focuses on process of sequential reflection and action carried out with and by the community rather than on them. It is important to note here that it's always carried out with the community rather than on community members. So community members are active participants in all phases of the research project, starting with developing the research idea to the dissemination of the research process, of the research findings. There is an iterative work related to reflection, planning, research, and action. And for a project to be participatory action research, there must be participation by members of the group, there must be research, a research component, and data gathering, and there must be a component related to action, taking action to improve conditions. Local knowledge and perspective are not only acknowledged, but form the basis of research and planning. So we go beyond hegemonic conception of knowledge to really looking at the knowledge that the community possesses and how we can capitalize on this. There's also a participatory view of knowledge generation, so participants are active in the knowledge generation process. PAR, community-based PAR, is community research that is power equalizing. So there's the need to consider the power relations that occurs during the research process. And also it involves a collaborative research approach with the community members as partners in the research process, and also being community members as experts in issues that are of concern to them. It's also based on principles of shared leadership. It requires the researcher to decenter themselves as the leader in the research process, but to share the leadership with members of the affected community. Collaborative decision making, where the researcher is not the only one making decisions, but the decision making process is shared by all members of the research team. And it's often time intensive because of the need to build trust within the community, and it's aimed at sustainable action-oriented research outcomes. Some of the purpose of community-based participatory research is to understand and improve the world by changing it. So while other research, including critical ethnography, and phenomenology, will focus on understanding experiences and understanding the world, participatory action research also has the dual purpose of seeing ways in which things can be changed for the better. It involves the co-creation of knowledge that is useful for the community by co-researchers, including members of the research team, and the development also of a sense of community among community members. There's a need to educate each other by negotiating meaning, and there's a need to build capacity within the community while also recognizing the strengths that the communities have, and to raise consciousness about the state of the world and the state of knowledge, and also to mobilize to change, generate, and evaluate practices or policies. Some of the major consideration includes reflects questioning about the nature of knowledge and the extent to which knowledge can represent the interest of the powerful and serve to represent their position. So within this, it's important to be reflexive and to examine one's positionality within the research project, including how those positionalities influence the research process and the data collected in the research process. It affirms the experience can be a basis of knowing, and the experiential learning can lead to legitimate forms of knowledge that influences practice. So experiences that participants have can actually be a great strength in terms of influencing and promoting conditions. It also attends to issues related to power relations, and as I will discuss later, there are always relations of power in the research process, and the researcher must be reflexive about this and take actions to equalize as much as possible relations of power. It involves being reflexive, flexible, so as opposed to some research methods that you can have a set research methods and go with it. Due to the reflective nature of the Participatory Action Research Project, things may change as the research evolves. And it's an iterative process, so it's not a linear process. So originated originally from Lewin's work, but most of the, and Lewin's work is more of an action-oriented and very further developed community-based participatory research. And most of those that use community-based participatory research tend to come from a critical social science, critical social paradigm. Participants take an explicit political stance, and they focus on empowering different disenfranchised and marginalized groups to take action, to transform their lives. So there's a need to really build community capacity and also to empower the community to be able to improve their lives in meaningful ways. There's a need to acknowledge multiple realities and also the co-construction of knowledge among research team members and also co-researchers and research participants. Some of the challenges of participatory action research involves time. So the time, it often requires time, both to build relationship with participants, to arrive at a consensus related to directions for research, and also to go through the research process. Some see it as costly in terms of the resources that are invested, in terms of mobilizing and building capacity of community members. And oftentimes it requires ethical considerations. So one of those that I have come across is issues related to data access for participants, and that in relation to also issues with confidentiality of the data. Challenges that researchers often have is meeting priorities of funding agencies related to when you're doing research, and also meeting academic interest versus the community interest. And I would, as someone that has been engaged within the community quite a lot, that I always prioritize community interest rather than academic interest. But for those involved in this, sometimes that may mean having less publication because you put your community interest first. So for example, when I do participatory action research project, I always ensure that the community, in terms of dissemination, that the community receives the findings before any work is published in any other form. So I will give an example of a participatory action research project that we completed to promote the mental health of African, Black, and Caribbean youths in Alberta. So one of the questions, and when I've done research related to immigrant populations or ethnic minorities in Canada, one of the questions that people ask is why. So sometimes you go into some communities and people ask you the question, why are you interested in this? And as researchers, we must be prepared to really be able to articulate some of our motivations for engaging in the work. In terms of my positionality, I myself am a Black African that lives in Alberta, and I grew up as a youth in Canada. My work started, I am quite involved in the African community and Black community in Alberta, and I was once a board member of Africa Center, an immigrant serving agency in Edmonton, Alberta. And at that time, when I was a board member, we had a discussion on the board about some of the challenges that the youth were having in terms of running their program and also being able to move forward in terms of the activity, and the fact that they had no funding or no support to be able to move forward. So I had a conversation with the executive director of Africa Center at that time about basically how can I be of help to the youth. And at that time, he connected me with the leader of the youth group, which is the YEG Come Up group of Alberta, to find a way how I can support the youth in terms of being able to actually do the work that they want to do and the good work that they have done in the past. So we had an initial meeting with the youths, and this is part of actually having the questions come up from members of the team. I met with around 8 Black youths of the Come Up group to discuss how I can be of help to them as a researcher. And the youth identified and prioritized mental health as a priority issue for them to focus on. That was of importance to them. They also identified several factors that they think were of key consideration in terms of addressing mental health. They emphasize a participatory approach. And I remember one of the youth emphasizing that we don't just want to be involved in the research project. We want to be at the forefront of the research project. The youth chose, and this were, the youth I met with were college youth, high school youth, but some of them had also graduated. They chose to use an intersectionality perspective as a theoretical framework that they said they thought was useful in informing their work. They've also focused on focusing on the collective experience of African, Black, and Caribbean youth, rather than individual experiences. So they wanted to focus on the commonalities rather than differences in mental health experience across this group. And they discussed the need to build capacity of youth, such as engaging them as research assistants in the process. And they demonstrated the willingness to contribute to the research project. So for the writing process, we decided to apply for Policy-Wise Children and Families because they had a call for proposal on mental health. And the youth leader of the group was a co-investigator on the research project, as well as the executive director. We engaged the youth leader in the writing process, and we also engaged in reflection on priorities of the youth in alignment with the funding agencies. And this sometimes required discussions to be able to ensure that the goals of the youth were not, the goals of the funding agencies did not overshadow the needs of the youth. Some of the challenges that we encountered was the short time for article submission and how long it takes to be able to actually build the capacity of youth in the writing process. So sometimes we had to take on more than we had in research related to completing the writing. So a rationale for our project in Alberta in 2011, which was the data we had at that time, we had about 25,000 individuals of Caribbean heritage and 78,000 individuals of African origin. Yet there was little research on the health of African, Black, and Caribbean youth in the province. We had evidence in Canada that African, Black, and youths have the highest rate of mental health problems than the general Canadian population. And despite this emerging evidence, we found no research study in Canada. There were some in in the US. It has provided the basis for action that could improve the health of African, Black, and Caribbean youths within the social cultural context in which they live. So our research questions were to look at the mental health needs of African, Black, and Caribbean youth in Alberta, to look at the barriers to access and use of mental health services for African and Caribbean youths, to look at the culturally relevant and effective approaches to increasing access and uptake of mental health services. And most of these research questions were really guided by the priorities of the funding agencies. And also, based on our focus on using a participatory approach to research and intersectionality, we also wanted to look at what potential exists to mobilize African, Black, and Caribbean youths to improve mental health outcomes and build on their resilience and capitalize on their strengths and also on their agency in Alberta. We used a combination of intersectionality theory and post-colonial theory. And intersectionality theory is really attends to looking at the intersections of diverse social locations and how those could influence the mental health or health of African immigrants, of Black youth. And we also use post-colonial theory by going beyond the colonial approach to research to really acknowledge the knowledge that youth possess and acknowledging that will be useful in terms of improving their status and a strengths-based perspective. Both of this perspective in line with the participatory research requires attention to the agency of youth and also being reflexive. In creating a safe and positive environment and in encouraging participation, we acknowledge different histories and impact of socioeconomic and political marginalization experienced by African, Caribbean, and Black youths. And even though we group this together, we acknowledge that there are differences within them. So we sought to do a sub-analysis. We also sought to provide spaces for critical reflection and community engagement to allow youth to understand the forces that influence their life, articulate their experience, and recognize their capacity for creating change. We also make explicit our commitment to providing a space for youth to use their voices and recognizing simultaneously their strengths and capacity for resilience. So the method we use interviews with 30 Black youths aged 16 to 30. Half of the interviews were done by the co-researchers, so the youths that I will discuss later, and the other half were done by a research assistant who mentored the youths in the process. We also did a series of 4 conversation cafes. Conversation cafes were on general mental health. We had one on intersectionality. We had one on dealing with intergenerational relationships. And we also had one on policy. And each of those topics were decided by, based on the data, were decided by, the decision was made by the youths in terms of what they would like to prioritize. And we did a series of conversation cafes with 99 youths. Conversation cafe were open forum for stimulating dialogue on relevant societal issues and issues relevant to mental health. During the conversation cafes, we had small breakout sessions that were facilitated by youths, and we also held larger group sessions with a guest speaker. So we had a guest speaker that was an expert in mental health. So for example, we had a guest speaker that was a counseling psychologist, lead a conversation related to intergenerational trauma and intergenerational relations. And we also had youths co-facilitate the sessions during the breakout session. And this helped in terms of building and bridging knowledge gaps between youths and also between the medical and health systems. So before beginning our project, we set up an advisory committee. We sent an advertisement to all youths that were part of the Youth Come Up group to invite people who wanted to be on the advisory committee. 10 youths indicated interest, to act as advisory committee members, and all 10 youths that indicated interest were engaged. During the first advisory committee meeting, youth expressed the need that they wanted to really engage and collect the data themselves. The way for us to go about this, because it takes their time, was to formally hire them as research assistants on the project so that they can be paid for the time they spend in terms of collecting data. Of the 10 youths, about 7 youths decided that they wanted to engage as research assistants on the project. In addition, there was one youth that did not want to be engaged as paid research assistant, but she wanted to continue to be actively involved, but as an advisory committee member, and that was allowed. Advisory committee members, based on the composition of the come-up group, they were all female, or either female or non-binary, and this reflected the composition of the come-up group. But this is a great consideration in terms of recruitment, because of the composition of the advisory committee to some extent reflected the type of participants we had in our research project. So for example, we had a little bit more female participants eventually participate in the research project, and we had a little bit more educated or university students, because a lot of those that were involved in the come-up group were university students. Advisory committee members met 3 times throughout the research process, and the funding that we received was for only over a year period. So we had to really move fast. Sub-teams of members met with the graduate research assistant, who was also Black but was not a youth, and the lead researcher an additional about 6 times before each conversation cafe. The youth also had their own meeting, and having their own meeting for the youths helped in terms of equalizing the power relations, because they were much more free to be able to talk among themselves. So initial planning for advisory committee members. So our initial plans was for advisory committee members to advise on data collection procedures, including delivery of conversation cafes, facilitate participant recruitment, contribute to data analysis, advise on knowledge translation and dissemination, and also recommend strategies to increase usefulness of research findings. However, most of those, the 7 that were on the advisory committee, did much more than this. The research assistants did interview of about 50% of the participants, while my other graduate research assistant, who mentored them, did interview of about 50%. We organized, and they organized and they led conversation cafes. So they chose the topics of the cafe with support from I and other researchers. They developed the agenda for the conversation cafe, and they also co-led the conversation cafes. They developed the initial conversation cafe guide. They also facilitated participant recruitment. So some of them recruited participants. We also recruited participants through other means that we had available to us. But some of the participants were recruited by the co-researchers. They also, 2 of them were analyzed data, and they were trained in the data analysis process to analyze all the data. And they co-author reports and also co-author publications. So now we are currently writing publications, and we've divided different sections for different people to write. And they are also involved in writing different sections of the publications, and they will be co-authors on that. To be able to, undertake this research process, we needed to build the capacity of research assistants, so of co-researchers. So we held a 4-hour training on qualitative research, research ethics, and participatory action research. During the 4-hour training, we held a mock interview session during the training, and we also had a question and answer period where we answered questions. They also completed a research ethics online training module in addition to the training that they had received related to research ethics. A couple attended a one-day training session on the use of qualitative data analysis software. And after the training session, they met with an expert on the team who was good at analyzing qualitative data for one-on-one mentorship about how to analyze qualitative data. They had a close mentorship by two senior doctoral students, and at least at one meeting with project lead before each conversation cafe, we ended up having around about 6 meetings altogether. I also, especially when it was time for them to start contributing to the writing process, I provided them with an examples of works that I have done in the past, and they verbalized that those were really, really helpful in terms of assisting them to understand the writing process and the level of depth that is required in the writing process. Throughout the research process, we capitalized on the strengths, and it's the more we capitalize on the strengths of the youths in this research process, the more we realized that they were much stronger than we had thought that they were. So the youths that were involved in this, they were very, very strong in their abilities, and they were also they had a very critical perspective. And I think those critical perspective was based on their experience in the field. And there was also a need for patience, time, and also encouragement in the process, including ensuring the mental health of the youth as they went about their process, because they are also students that were also juggling their day-to-day activities as a student. So some of the success we had plans to recruit about 80 participants, 20 to 30, we recruited more. So we had plans to recruit 20 participants per conversation cafe, a total of 80. We recruited over 90 participants. We had rich data about Black youth mental health, and the data that we had was really, really informed by the positionalities of the youths, which made them be able to actually produce much more in-depth questions that we ourselves as researchers, even though we ourselves as researchers would not have been able to think as deeply about. Youths led and delivered the results to stakeholders. So we had held a stakeholder dissemination day where the youths invited stakeholders, including people from Public Health Agency of Canada and members of the Legislative Assembly to really hear about the mental health of Black youths. We also held a capacity building. It also was a capacity building and learning experience for youths. So youths have told me a lot of times how much they have learned through the process related to how to analyze data, how to collect, to complete qualitative research, and also how it's also contributing to building them and positioning them for their future careers, including the soft skills that are required related to presenting, which all of them had the opportunity to present at some point or facilitate a session, and also improving their organizational skills. We had the data and the future project to address youth mental health. So, in the last conversation cafes, youths came up with discussing how they wanted to create a mental health hub for Black youths in Alberta. And they are still in the process of trying to develop those ideas further, but those initial conversation cafe kind of provided them with some ideas in terms of how they can move mental health for Black youths forward. I just wanted to share with you one of the conversation cafe guides that the youths developed. And some of these questions are quite, they are questions that if I was developing a conversation cafe guide or, either a conversation cafe or interview guide or questions I would have never thought about. But when you look at these questions, you know that these questions are questions that the youths themselves have had to grapple with in their everyday experiences in Canada. So some of the youths, for example, talked about Your parents are a few of many immigrants who have escaped civil war. You experience signs of PTSD in one of your parents, and you ain't at it. They're in denial. How would you approach them about this? How would you respond? And I remember when we discussed this question during the conversation cafe, it provoked a lot of comments because there were youths whose parents were actually going through this and who had actually had this type of discussion in their family in the past, or who were in fear of asking the type of discussion. And the expert on the team was able to actually steer the youths the direction of how they may be able to approach a question like this with their parents. You decide you do not want to go to university but wish to pursue a different career. How do you think your parents will react? Again, this was a question that youths also struggled with, especially because many of them were at that stage, either in university or about to go to university. And I remember when this question was asked, a lot of them were nodding. And there were several other questions, including related to anti-Black racism that the youths discussed, that was important to them to be discussed and for them to really be able to learn about and learn how to navigate it as Black youths in Canada. So the Conversation Cafe was not just a data gathering exercise, it was also an exercise to empower the youth on how to navigate complex challenges, including challenges that may have an influence or an impact on their mental health in Canada. So in terms of dissemination, the youth chose the choice of their dissemination strategy. So for example, publication, report to community, and we also presented at an event. And during the presentation, we've presented once in the past, and the youths I was actually not involved in that presentation. They did the presentation themselves, but I mentored them through developing their PowerPoint. So I wasn't a quarter, it was their work. Engagement in dissemination activities and also leading dissemination activities in some sense, and also capacity. There's also a need for you to consider authorship. So, and that's, sometimes a complex consideration in terms of, the amount of time different individuals on the team have invested in the research process, and also ensuring that you're fair to the youth in terms of the dissemination process. Some of the challenges that we've come across relate to power relations. Most of the members of the group, or actually half of the members of the initial research team the academic researchers, were members of the research team. And within the Black community, we have a strong value of respect. And sometimes that may make it difficult for youths to be able to really verbalize their actions. In a lot of the meetings that we had, because of that, the meeting was just with High as a researcher and the youth, so that the youth, their voices dominated the meeting rather than it being a minority within the meeting. The other thing is that before the youths come to a meeting, they always have a meeting before the meeting. So that helped them in terms of being able to organize themselves and really being able to capitalize on and really being able to really equalize the power relations. The graduate research assistant hired for the project was really a powerful tool in terms of navigating the power relations with youth. So he was also a Black, but he wasn't really a youth, but the relationship that he had developed with the youth was really, really powerful in terms of ensuring that the youth were free to actually ask the team any questions. The project could have taken time, but we were quite good in terms of ensuring that we stick to the 1 year. And 1 year to complete a participatory action research project is quite short, but we created a timeline. And it was very, very important that at the beginning, instead of us selecting members of the advisory committee, that they were the ones that indicated that they were interested. So they were very, very motivated to move things forward. I realized that they tend to be much more motivated during the conversation cafe period because they felt like it was more useful to their community rather than during when we were collecting interviews. There was also a need for us to be flexible in terms of our methodology and our methods. So, there were things, that we had proposed in the research process. So, for example, our sample size increased in the research when we had submitted our research proposal. Our plan was to have only 2 research assistants, but we ended up having 8. So we had to really adjust our budget. So communication with the funding agency about things that we were doing and changes that we were making based on our participatory approach was important. We also had to reconcile gaps between academic priorities and also the community priorities. So academic priorities says publish, publish, publish. Community priorities says, how is this important for the community? And we prioritize the latter, what was important to the community and how to build the capacity and the strengths of the youth involved. And some of the challenges that we also had was confidentiality and data security, because a lot of the youths knew people that were engaged in the research process. We wanted to ensure that the data was secure and that confidentiality was maintained. What we did during the interview process was we had a shared drive where we created different folders for different youths. So youths had information about the interviews that they collected, but they didn't have information about interviews that others collected. Of the youth, we chose 2 youths that volunteered to analyze all the data. So 2 youths of them were involved in knowing everything about the research across all research data sets. And the analysis that they did was then presented back to the larger group, and then the larger group commented before then we move forward with the analysis. I believe that's about it with my presentation. Feel free, if you have any questions, to contact me. My email address is there, my Twitter account is there, and there's a whole wealth of information on IIQM webinars that are on the archive, and the archive email address is there. Thank you so much. And
Thank you. Thank you very
that...
much, Dr. Salami. Now let's proceed to answer some questions. We have 10 minutes left, so I'm going to read some of those questions. Let me see. Shefali Singh is asking, please explain me primary data, because my research depends on primary data as well as secondary data.
So I think what you mean is, if we are collecting primary data. So primary data, for example, is when you're the one that collects the data yourself. For example, you went out and you did interviews, you did survey, and for participatory action research, you can use, you don't have to use qualitative only, you can use quantitative, you can use multiple sources of the data collection. So that is totally fine. And there are also ways that participatory action research, for example, can use some secondary data, although probably not the only data that will be available, integrating it into the findings. So I've done some work in the past where we've considered, for example, including a systematic review of the literature into the data that we collect before really moving forward and informing the work and collecting more data related to interviews and things from participants. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. I have another one. Shaheen is asking, she or he wrote, thank you, Dr. Salami. Can you speak to strategies used to deal with language barriers within your research projects connecting with migrants?
So there are several strategies to deal with language barriers within my research project. I can talk a lot about research. So, a way for you to do this is, there's 2 ways. You can get an interpreter to help in the interpretation process. or you can do the you can hire someone that has knowledge about that specific language, especially, for example, if you're planning to only interview people and all of them speak the same language, and then you can translate, you can have it translated. So if you get an interpreter, there's two ways you can have, the ideal way is for you to translate the data after it is done, and also back translate at least a few of the transcript to check the accuracy of the data. The challenge with that is oftentimes it's quite expensive, and that's why qualitative research is sometimes very expensive. When I've tried to do translation and back translation, it costed about $2,000. A way that I have navigated it sometimes for transcript is to have an interpreter there to do the interpretation, and then have us transcribe what the interpreter says. But of course, that is lesser quality. But you also have to be careful when you're working with immigrants related to who exactly is doing the interpretation. There's, people may talk about Arabic, but Arabic is different based on what region of the world you come from. So not all those that speak Arabic will actually understand each other fluently. And when I've done research with migrants, people have also talked to me about the need to consider the power issues that may occur among participants. So for example, if you're interviewing someone about issues related to domestic violence, you may want to consider, do you want to really pay attention to which gender is serving as an interpreter in the research process? The other thing that you may want to consider is, people have told me, for example, interviewing someone, for example, that is from Afghanistan, and you can just imagine, oh, both of them, they speak the same language, they can understand themselves. But maybe one is from a Taliban tribe, and the other one is from Pashto tribe. And then, the fact that you're doing interviews, and one of them sees himself as the oppressor, and the other sees himself as the oppressed, especially mental health research, that may not go too well. The other thing that I've come across in the research project that I did on mental health of children is really, really paying attention to participants giving informed consent. So ensuring that participants actually fully understand the research process, and that they actually are literate in their language. So it's one thing, to be able to speak the language. It's another thing to be able to actually be literate either in your own language or in another language. And I've come across in some of my work with refugee populations that sometimes the literacy skill may be a challenge. One thing that has happened in the past is, I try to interview one or two women, and they'll tell me, oh, they normally use glasses, but they don't have their glasses with them. But then we arrive inside their house. So I realized from there that it was probably issues with understanding, the informed consent form. So really providing an interpreter in that sense, but ensuring that the process is not a shameful process for participants in the research process. So I hope that answers your question. In summary, the golden rule is translation, and also back translation to check for accuracy, but that may be costly, to some. So some sometimes rely on, doing an interpreter and having that transcribed, and in that way, you can go from that $2,000 to going to around $90 per interview.
Thank you. Deepa has a question. How do you involve your community in research? At which stage community is involved?
So the ideal is for the community to be involved at the start of the research process, before even applying for the funding. Because if you involve them after you've gotten the funding, the problem is that you might have identified priorities that are not the priorities of the research team members. So for example, I did a research project where on parenting practices, and I remember we were members of, I am also a member of the committee, and I submitted a proposal. And one of the things that I said that we are going to do is observe participants related to parenting practices. And then I remember during our discussion, our first interview, the community members, community leaders that were in our stakeholder session really said, no, that's not going to be working. And we need to eliminate that whole aspect of observation. So the ideal is really, really to involve, to get them to engage in the community and have the community actually be the ones to start the research process. So a good way for you to do this, I work with an immigrant research myself, is really, really engaging within the community. A lot of research communities and also a lot of indigenous communities have had researchers that just basically fly and collect data and fly out. And a lot of research, immigrant communities are really, really looking much more forward to a collaborative working relationship and long-term trust and relationship building with researchers. So I would say the stages before the research process, you can always meet with the community and really, really find out what they need and see, okay, how can we really align what they need? And how can we really build their capacity in terms of framing this as a research project or a project that would actually improve their well-being. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have only 4 minutes left before we end, so I think the best would be that we now start with the closing remarks. But if there are questions, and I know that there are many questions that were not answered, would it be okay if people send those questions to you by through writing?
Yes, that would be great. That would be awesome.
Okay, perfect. So we can do that. So now I would like to ask my colleague Juliana Barabas from IIQM to say a few closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Bukola and Ricardo. That was highly informative, and thank you so much for your time and your expertise through this webinar. I just want to say thank you again to ATLAS.ti and to all of our attendees through the 2019-2020 season of these webinars. We're looking forward to restarting this webinar series in September, of course, as per the, and thank you, Ricardo, for bringing up the archive. That's perfect. We also have a blog, IIQM at WordPress.com, where you can find information as we are updating offerings for the fall. You can follow us on Facebook, on Twitter. We also have a number of channels on YouTube. The videos that are driven here, if you're looking just to watch the video, YouTube channels are great, but if you're wanting the slideshow and the video and sometimes question and answers as well, coming to this archive all the way back to 2013, as Ricardo is showing you here. It's a rich resource that I'm sure many of you will find very worthwhile checking out over these summer months while we are planning towards the fall. So again, thank you to Bukola, Salami, and to Ricardo and ATLAS.ti and Eve as well. And we hope everyone has a safe and productive summer. Or restorative.
Thank you very much, Juliana. Everybody, thank you again for coming today, and please come, keep on coming. These webinars are successful and have been successful since 2013 because of your participation. So your participation is crucial for our continuous success. And now I would like to ask Dr. Salami to say a few closing remarks.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great, presenting. And please, if you have any questions, feel free to email me from my email, and I'll be posting my slide online. And once again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, all of you, and see you in hopefully soon, June or July, in our next webinar. Thank you, all of you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.